All right, so ready to dive into this. The 2024 Reuters Institute Digital News Report. It's a big one.
It really is. 47 countries.
47.
Yeah, covering everything from, TikTok trends to how AI is changing the way we get our news.
It's like a global snapshot, right, of the entire news ecosystem.
Exactly. And it's got the good, the bad.
Oh, I'm sure there's some surprises in there.
Oh, there are definitely some wait, what moments. It's really fascinating.
And that's, I think, why this deep dive is so important, because it's not just about, like, knowing the headlines. This report gets into those bigger forces that are shaping what we see, what we hear, maybe even what we believe about the world.
I totally agree, yeah. And I think a good place to start is with something everyone can relate to. How we even access news has changed. Like, remember when it was all about news websites and apps?
Oh, yeah, I'm getting flashbacks. Feeling a little old school now.
Right. But globally, relying on those sources as your main way to get news, that's plummeted since 2018. It's a huge shift, and it's all about video now. Especially those short, quick news clips, the kind you see on YouTube, on TikTok.
Yeah, like news snacking, bite-sized content. And the report had some wild stats about that. Like in Thailand, 87% of people are checking out those short news videos every week.
87.
Wow. Yeah. Here in the U.S., it's more like 60%. But the U.K., they're way behind. Only 39%.
That's a huge difference. And what's even more interesting is that this trend, it's even more pronounced among young people. Like, imagine growing up with news delivered in these really quick visual bursts.
Yeah, it's a completely different way of engaging with information.
Absolutely. And it presents a real challenge for those traditional news outlets that are trying to keep up.
Yeah, it's almost like the old guard is being challenged by this whole new wave of voices. And speaking of that, the report actually digs into this rise of news creators, influencers, commentators, people who, they aren't necessarily journalists, but they're definitely shaping the narrative these days.
Right. It's not just established news brands calling the shots anymore. And the report uses some interesting examples, like Tucker Carlson in the U.S. He left Fox News and he's built this huge following on YouTube.
Yeah, and it's not just in the U.S. Like in the U.K., you've got these clips from James O'Brien's radio show, and they go viral on YouTube, TikTok.
Interesting.
And get this, even the president of Argentina is using TikTok.
Really? What for?
Well, he's amassed like 2.2 million followers.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of amazing. So it really is this whole new world. But, the million-dollar question with all these new voices popping up is,
Right.
Is it a good thing?
Yeah.
And the report, to its credit, does encourage us to really think critically about it.
Yeah.
Because there are potential downsides, right? Like increased partisanship. You've got the spread of misinformation. And, are these voices being held to the same journalistic standard?
Right, exactly. Because it's not as simple as saying like, oh, more voices equals more democracy. It's much more complicated than that.
Definitely. And I think that's what makes it so tricky for people who are just trying to stay informed.
Yeah.
You've got more choices now, but you also have a bigger responsibility to figure out what's reliable, what's not. To sort the,
The good from the bad.
Exactly.
It's a minefield out there.
It really is.
Yeah.
And that actually brings us to another, I think, crucial point in the report, which is navigating this minefield of misinformation. Because globally, people are worried about it.
Yeah.
Fake news, it's a real concern, especially when you think about topics like politics, health, anything with global conflict.
It gets very murky.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the report, it doesn't beat around the bush. Over a quarter of TikTok users say they have trouble telling real news from fake news on that platform, which is, by the way, the highest of any platform.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. And it's a good reminder of why we need to be thinking critically about the information we're consuming.
Absolutely. And why media literacy is so important now.
Yeah, like being able to evaluate a source, understand its biases.
Right, and its motivations.
Yes. Because if we zoom out for a second, it's about understanding why certain platforms are just more vulnerable to this kind of manipulation.
Right.
Like,
what is it about these platforms that makes them
breeding grounds for misinformation.
Oh, exactly. And the report actually dives into a specific example to illustrate this point, and they use X.
Oh, formerly Twitter.
Yes, formerly Twitter, right. And they highlight how algorithmic changes. So essentially how the platform decides what you see in your feed, how these changes can have a huge impact on what information actually spreads, even if it's totally baseless.
Yeah, and it's not always intentional, right? Like, an algorithm doesn't think the way a human does.
No, exactly. It's just looking for patterns, and sometimes those patterns...
And engagement.
Yes, exactly. And sometimes those things can be misleading.
And unfortunately lead to, rumors catching fire and going viral.
Yeah.
It's almost like trying to,
It's like holding water in your hands.
yes, exactly. You think you have a grasp on it, and then some new platform or technology comes along and changes everything.
Constantly.
Yeah, always moving. But before we completely spiral into despair,
Okay, good.
the report does offer a little bit of good news on the trust front.
Okay, I'm ready for some good news. What's the good news?
So globally, trust in news is actually relatively stable.
Oh, okay.
It's still lower than it was during like the peak of the pandemic, but it hasn't, continued to fall off a cliff, which is,
Yeah, that's something.
yeah, we'll take any win we can get at this point.
I agree.
But, when we say stable, there's actually a pretty big range there.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Right. Because the report found that Finland, they take the prize for the highest levels of trust in news,
Okay.
like 69%.
Wow, good for them.
Yeah. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have countries like Greece and Hungary, and they're both way down at 23%.
That's a huge gap. Like, what's going on there? Why such a big difference?
Well, the report, points to a few things. Political influence over media, corporate influence,
Yeah.
really all comes back to transparency,
Right.
journalistic standards,
Mhm.
fair representation. Those seem to be the kind of core pillars that build trust with audiences.
It makes sense because if you don't have those
It all
things,
falls apart.
Yeah.
People need to know that, even if they don't agree with everything you're reading or hearing,
it's coming from a good place.
exactly, like they're not trying to,
Pull one over on you or something.
right. So it's not just about getting the information out there. It's also about how you present it,
Totally.
the values that are driving the reporting.
Because if people don't believe in the source, they're not going to trust the information.
Exactly. And unfortunately, this leads us to another kind of worrying trend that the report uncovered, which is this idea of news fatigue and avoidance.
Mm.
Basically, more people are just tuning out the news altogether.
Really?
Yeah, they're just done, which, I get it.
I mean, it's understandable.
It's a lot.
It's a lot of negativity. It's overwhelming.
Information overload
Yeah.
all the time. And the report actually mentioned that in the UK, interest in news has practically been cut in half since 2015.
Wow.
It's a big deal because if people are constantly tuning out, they're missing this vital information.
That they need to make informed decisions.
Absolutely. About their lives, about the world around them. It's like trying to make a decision.
With only half the pieces of the puzzle.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a real concern. And I think, news organizations are trying to figure out how to combat this. There's been a lot of talk about this idea of constructive journalism. Have you heard of that?
I have, yeah. But can you remind me, what does that actually look like in practice?
Basically, instead of just focusing on problems, on everything that's going wrong, it tries to also highlight solutions and positive change.
Well, thus the world is ending and more like,
And more like, here are some ways we can actually make things better.
okay, so it's not about shying away from the tough stuff, but also giving people a sense of hope.
Exactly, and a sense of agency.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's easy to feel helpless and overwhelmed when you're just bombarded with negativity, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
And to be honest, if something makes me feel that way, I'm probably just going to avoid it altogether.
Right, and that's exactly what news organizations want to avoid. So by focusing on solutions, it's a way to keep people engaged, to show them that their actions can actually make a difference.
Yeah, because then it's not just about knowing about a problem. It's about feeling empowered to do something about it.
Exactly. And speaking of what makes people tick, the report also got into some really interesting stuff about why people engage with the news in the first place. They basically broke it down into 4 main needs.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Hit me with them.
So they talk about knowledge, understanding, feeling, and doing.
All right, so the first two, those seem pretty straightforward. Like,
Yeah.
we want the news to help us, I don't know, understand the world, right? Stay in the loop.
Yeah, exactly. Those are kind of the basic knowledge needs, just staying updated, expanding our knowledge about what's going on. But it gets more interesting when you look at those feeling and doing needs.
Okay, so beyond just knowing the facts, what are we talking about here?
Well, feeling gets at this whole other, more emotional aspect of news consumption because people, even when they're reading the news, they're also looking for things that make them feel something. Inspired, connected to others, maybe even entertained.
Right, so it's not just about, like, cold, hard facts. It's about how the news makes us feel, that emotional connection.
Exactly. And then doing, that's about the more practical side. We want news that helps us make decisions, take action, even if it's just starting a conversation with someone.
So it's kind of the difference between just, like, reading about a problem and actually doing something to address it.
Yeah, Exactly. And what the report found, which I thought was interesting, was that for younger audiences, those feeling and doing needs, they're actually even more important than just the straight up knowledge part. They want news that resonates with them on a personal level, that connects to their lives in a tangible way.
Which makes a lot of sense,
Yeah.
considering what we were just talking about with, the rise of these news influencers and those shorter, more like emotionally engaging formats.
Exactly. It's all connected because these
Right.
influencers, they get it, right? Platforms like YouTube, TikTok, they're really tapping into those feeling and doing needs in a way that traditional outlets haven't quite figured out yet.
Right. It's like they're speaking the language of a generation that grew up with the internet,
Yeah.
where it's not just about what you say, it's about how you say it.
Yes, 100%.
And speaking of how people are engaging, the report also looked at where people are getting their news. Like what platforms are they using?
Yeah, and it's kind of a mixed bag because while social media is still huge, search engines, those news aggregator websites, they're still like the main gateways for most people when it comes to online news, but it's definitely shifting. Like only about a fifth of people said that their main source was a news website or app.
So even if we're reading like an article from a big newspaper, we're not necessarily getting there directly from their website anymore.
Exactly, which presents a huge challenge for these news organizations, right? Because they're trying to figure out how do we build a direct connection with our audience? How do we reach people in this really fragmented landscape?
Yeah, because Facebook is different from TikTok, which is different from Instagram.
Totally. And the types of sources that really dominate on those platforms, it's fascinating how much it varies. Like on Facebook and X, you still have these like traditional brands and journalists. They still carry a lot of weight in those spaces.
Okay, so it's not like the old guard has been completely pushed out just yet.
Not completely, no. But then you go to these other platforms like Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, and suddenly it's a different story.
What's happening on those?
It's all about those alternative voices. Influencers, celebrities, they're the ones driving the conversation, especially among younger people.
It's interesting though, right? Because it's like this whole battle for attention, and those newer, maybe non-traditional voices, they figured out how to stand out.
Yes, they're the ones cutting through the noise. And the report highlights some really fascinating examples of these news
Oh,
influencers.
like who?
Well, in the US, for instance, some of the most mentioned accounts were people like Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan.
So in the US, it seems like it's a lot of those like opinion-driven commentators.
Right. And what's even more interesting is that the report found that in the US, all of the top 10 most mentioned accounts for news, they were all men.
Interesting.
And not just men, but men who are known for their political commentary, not necessarily like original reporting or anything like that.
Right. Which, I mean, that raises some important questions, I think, about diversity, about representation in the types of voices that are shaping our news.
Exactly. It's not just about what information is being shared, it's who is doing the sharing and whose voices are being amplified in these spaces.
Absolutely. It's something we need to be really mindful of because just because something is popular or it's shared a lot, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's, the be-all, end-all
Right.
or that it's representative of the full story.
Absolutely. And it's on us as news consumers to really, like you said before, think critically about what we're seeing and where it's coming from. And something else the report touched on that I thought was really interesting was this idea that, how people engage with news and who they trust. It varies quite a bit around the world.
Oh, really? So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Not at all. For instance, in the UK, they found that most of the news citations on social media were actually still coming from like mainstream media brands, journalists, things like that. The most mentioned account was actually a radio host named James O'Brien. Yeah, and his clips, they often go viral on YouTube and TikTok, so very different from that US example.
Right. So it seems like these power dynamics are still very much influenced by the specific media landscape of a country, which is,
Of course, it makes sense.
it makes sense when you think about it.
Yeah, it's super complex. And the report acknowledges this. They're like, look, this is constantly changing. There are potential benefits to all this. There are potential risks. It's something we just need to pay attention to because these platforms are always evolving and, they're influencing what we see, what we hear, how we think about the news.
Speaking of evolving platforms, I'm curious, did the report talk about podcasts at all?
They did.
Because they're kind of having a moment, right?
They are. But actually, the findings on news podcasts specifically were a little surprising because even though podcast listening in general has been on the rise, news podcasts, They haven't really seen much growth in like the past 7 years.
Oh, wow. So even though podcasts are booming, news podcasts haven't really caught that wave.
Yeah. And the report sort of suggested that it might be because those more traditional print publishers, they're often the ones behind the biggest news podcasts,
Right.
but they're kind of struggling to compete with, the sheer variety of entertainment podcasts, niche podcasts.
It's a tough market. People are spoiled for choice, so
Mhm.
you really have to offer something special as a news podcast to like really break through.
Totally. And people have their favorites. But one thing the report did point out that I thought was really interesting was this trend of like podcasts being filmed
Oh, yeah.
and then shared on platforms like YouTube.
Which is kind of cool. It's like blurring the lines between audio and video.
Totally. So, maybe the future of news podcasting isn't just about audio. Maybe it's about incorporating that visual element too, to keep those viewers engaged, those listeners engaged.
Because people are used to that now.
Exactly. But no matter the platform or format, the report emphasized this one crucial element that underpins everything: trust.
Trust. That's the magic word, isn't it? Like
It all falls apart.
it does. The whole news ecosystem just crumbles. So what do they say about like the key ingredients for building trust?
Yeah, they found that it doesn't really matter like what age group you're talking about, political leanings, any of that. People really value those same core principles: transparency, high journalistic standards, making sure different perspectives are represented fairly.
It's not about always agreeing with what you're seeing or reading or hearing, but knowing that it's coming from, a place of integrity.
Exactly. Like people might appreciate a news outlet that kind of shares their personal values, But those core values, the
Mm.
transparency, the standards, the fairness, those are the things that really build lasting trust.
Makes sense. Like I may not always like what I hear, but I need to know that it's accurate
Right.
and that the source is at least trying to be fair.
Exactly, that they've done their homework. And what's interesting is that, like, when trust starts to erode, it's often because people feel like those core values are missing.
It's a good point. It's almost like, you think about it like customer service.
Right.
Like you can have the best product in the world, but if your delivery is terrible, people are going to go somewhere else.
That is a great analogy. And I think the report is saying that, news organizations need to do a better job of showcasing those values.
Yeah.
Like being upfront about their process, admitting when they make mistakes, making sure they're including different voices, just really demonstrating, hey, we are committed to quality and fairness.
Show your work. Don't just expect people to take your word for it.
Okay.
And speaking of different perspectives, there was this really interesting part about what the report called the other divide when it comes to trust.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that.
It wasn't necessarily about traditional, like, political affiliations.
Uh-huh.
It was more about, like, this divide between people who are super into politics and those who aren't.
So it's not so much left or right wing. It's more like,
How much politics is a part of your whole worldview?
interesting.
And they found that people who are, like, really politically engaged, they tend to be a lot more discerning about their news sources. They often seek out outlets that,
Reinforce what they already believe,
exactly. So it's almost like they're looking for confirmation rather than information.
which is kind of the opposite of what we want, right?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, this is a challenge for news organizations because they're trying to reach a broad audience.
Mhm.
But they have to be aware of this, this other divide and how what they report might land with people who have very different levels of like political investment.
Right, because you can't just preach to the choir. They
Exactly.
got to reach people where they are.
And you can't shy away from important topics just because they might be controversial, but you have to be aware of like how people might interpret that information.
Exactly. And how they might be filtering it through their own experiences, their own biases.
Yeah. It's about like empowering people to be, informed and engaged citizens, which kind of brings us to this whole other side of things, which is how do news organizations actually survive in this, crazy digital world that's constantly changing?
The economics of it all.
Yes, because the report actually gets into the nitty-gritty of that.
Yeah, they do. And while subscription models, they've had some success.
Mm.
The report talked about like Norway and Sweden.
Yeah, those are like the stars?
They are. Almost half of people there pay for online news.
Wow.
But globally, the picture is very different.
Yeah, people are not so into it.
Not as much. And there's this thing called subscription fatigue, which is a real thing. Because people are hesitant to pay for something that for so long they've gotten for free.
Right. especially when there's so much out there.
Exactly. So many choices. It's a tough sell.
It really is.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what's the answer?
Well, the report explored a bunch of different models, paywalls, memberships, donations. The
Yeah.
takeaway was basically there's no magic solution.
Uyghurs.
Right. It's really about figuring out what works best for your audience and for your brand.
So, kind of like everything else we've been talking about,
Yeah.
it all comes back to know your audience and
You
know
are
yourself.
ill.
Exactly. Know yourself. It's a balancing act.
It really is. Trying to maintain that journalistic integrity, those high standards, but also making sure that you can actually, keep the lights on.
Yeah. It's a tough job.
It is. But someone's got to do it.
They do.
Yeah.
And thankfully, there are people out there who are really committed to figuring this out.
Definitely.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground. We talked about the power of platforms, the rise of these new voices, the threat of misinformation, the importance of trust. I mean, there's just so many factors at play here.
It's complex. But like you said, this report really does a great job of painting this picture of where we are right now, what the news ecosystem actually looks like in 2024.
And, maybe more importantly, why it matters.
Exactly. Because if we want to be informed citizens in this, ever-evolving digital world, we have to understand how these things work.
Absolutely. So we've given you the rundown of what the report found, but now we want to hear from you. Where do you get your news? What are your biggest concerns about navigating this whole information landscape? It's a question worth thinking about.
Definitely.
And, it's a conversation worth continuing.
Absolutely.
Stay curious out there.